Thanks very much, Hank. Welcome, everybody. And this is a terrific event we've got lined up today. And we're very privileged to have Senator Mark Warner from Virginia speaking to us today, because there aren't many people on Capitol Hill who have spent as much of their lives as deeply involved in the issues that we're talking about today, becoming using American competitiveness and innovation to make us all more prosperous and a more equitable society. Thanks very much for joining us, Senator Warren. I understand you're fresh from the campaign trail in Virginia, hoping to pull one off for the blue team. But you're also right in the thick of some pretty important negotiations on Capitol Hill. So let's just start off by bringing us up to date on where those things are. You and your colleagues have a big job ahead of you, trying to bring down the price tag of the Build Back Better reconciliation bill to something acceptable to your more moderate colleagues. Last week, we got news that one of the key components on climate, a clean energy performance plan, was unacceptable to your colleague and friend, Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia. What are your thoughts on his objections? How might the climate portion of the president's plan be rescued and remain part of this bill?
Well, thank you for having me, Greg, and it's always good to be with my friend Hank Paulson. I actually think the climate components of the package have some of the broadest support of any components. I mean, the part of the challenge with the second half, the Build Back Better program, was there were so many initiatives. I think I counted 17 at one point in the initial proposal. And so I think the Democrats have done not a very good job laying out which specific component parts when you've got so many to emphasize, and consequently the debate has moved to the top line rather than what the component parts are, number one. Number two, in terms of the clean energy standard, I think that would have been a useful tool, because I do believe that the climate concerns are the most significant. I understand Joe's concern that with utilities making this move, is this really the most efficient way to see meaningful improvement? We'd put in payments if they were getting a 4% reduction. Some of them are probably on normal course of business doing 2 to 3%. So how do you nudge them a little bit more? I have to say I'm still optimistic, and I've had a lot of conversations with Joe about this, that we might end up with a carbon tax or carbon fee, which I think is frankly a better global solution, and would also allow us, if we have that carbon fee in place, it would allow us to do the same kind of border adjustment tax that Canada and the EU is doing, particularly on products that come from places like China or India that are obviously very carbon intense in terms of the manufacturing of those products. So getting that carbon fee is key if we're going to do the border adjustment tax.
So that's let's follow up on that a little bit. So Senator Wyden, I believe has talked about replacing the Clean Energy Performance Plan with a $15 to $18 per ton carbon fee. You said is it your sense that Senator Manchin, that might be acceptable to Senator Manchin?
Well, listen. Joe wants to make sure that there is a phase-in time for the hard to deal with industries. Obviously, things like steel, concrete, some of the heavy industrial uses. I think there are ways to get that phase in time and still get the effectiveness of a global carbon tax or carbon fee, because I think that moves the whole debate around the world. Getting the details right is going to be the challenging part, and we've got a lot of details to work out on that.
So, but where you sit now, does it seem like that there is enough support in the Democratic caucus for a carbon fee to be part of this final bill?
I've been a strong supporter of a carbon fee for some time. I think there is, because this idea has not been as socialized, obviously was not included in the president's initial proposal, and how you do it with his constraints about nobody under $400,000 having any increased fees makes it a little bit more difficult. But if we're taking out the clean electric standard, this is I think actually a better default proposition to move to. Saying there's complete agreement in the Democratic caucus, I'm not going to go that far. It's very hard for me to say, where there's complete agreement in the Democratic caucus on virtually any topic.
What are your thoughts on the level that fee should be set at and how much it should rise over time?
I think, again, the initial pricing is less important in my mind than getting a price, recognizing it has to escalate, matching that where we've seen the price in the European trading scheme go up to, I believe, 60 euros, 65 euro. I would expect there to be a phase-in period in the United States, but I think American leadership here on a carbon fee would make dramatic steps in moving the rest of the world forward and gets us away from simply, some of the tinkering in terms of tax credits that, again, are useful, but I think we need both the incentives and we need some level of penalty, and obviously the carbon fee becomes downstream, at least that level of penalty if you don't make improvement.
What sectors initially would be covered by the fee? Just the power sector or a broader range of
Well, again, those are very much real-time conversations.
Well, thanks very much. It's I appreciate you. The folks on this call and the AESG are very fascinated by climate and carbon fees. So you'll excuse my interest on that a little bit. More broadly speaking, do you think, at least from your point of view, how do you feel about the prospects for consensus on the pay-fors of the bill, for example? Are you happy with where the conversation has come down with respect to capital gains rate, corporate tax rate, the GILTI fee?
The issue here, and this gets, there's been discussions. I think there needs to be a bit more transparency. I think I say, particularly to my colleagues who are running in 2022, that they probably ought to have a little more input on which taxes might be raised on Americans. As we were saying offline, I think there was broad consensus that raising the corporate rate to 25%, where most of corporate America was back in 2017, is still in that fairness zone. Taking the capital gains rate back up to 28 that it was under parts of President Reagan, I think makes some sense. Taking the top rate for the most successful up to 39, I think makes some sense. I think are certain senators. Senator Sinema has expressed concerns about any kind of official rate increases. So I don't know how even the $2 trillion number, I don't know how you get there without some rate increases. I'm spending a lot of time on the international regime. Obviously, I think it's great news that Secretary Yellen is making progress at that 15% global rate. I think we could even do a little higher than that in the United States, but I think we'll end up in that range. The complexities around the FDII provisions and the beat and shield for foreign companies investing in America, they are extraordinarily complicated. And I do hope that we will have enough time to get the details right, because in 2017, my critique, was the tax cut was too big. I thought, though, they did do good things like in deferral and bring some of the income back home, but they ended up making mistakes on some of the incentives, so that you could, the fact that somebody could put up their IP in Ireland and then build a factory in Germany, and on that factory in Germany get an implied 10% return for the life of the factory, 40 years. That seems a little much. So figuring out the international is going to be a component. Two other areas, I think there's some interesting ideas about how you get towards a minimum corporate tax. And there's a proposal going around that Senator Warren has put out, and that would put in place a 7% minimum corporate tax, but that would be taxed on profits based on GAAP accounting, not tax accounting. So a fairly different mode, but it does get at I think the very real problem where you have companies that are huge, profitable, the Amazons of the world climbing $20 billion a year on book profits, and that yet paying no taxes. So I think that's an area that needs some review. And then finally, the tax compliance issues. I think as Secretary Paulson and literally every other former Treasury Secretary went on a letter, with the exception of my friend Steve Mnuchin, but even Mnuchin has expressed that there's a lot of dollars left on the table in terms of IRS enforcement. That kind of breaks into two categories. One, just better technology and more people. The other is giving the dollar flow of business accounts at a certain size. There's been a lot of pushback on that idea, but I do think that idea in terms of tax compliance would be very effective, because in that bucket of tax compliance, I'm not sure I would go as high as Hank Paulson did, $600 or $700 billion a year, but I do think over 10 years you could probably generate $400 to $600 billion, which is a good slug of dough when you're talking about a total package that's roughly in the $2 trillion range. Sorry to get in the weeds on some of that stuff.
That's okay. Fascinating stuff and very important to a lot of folks listening in here. Let's get to the guts of the question that we're dealing with today, which is really, raising American living standards through innovativeness and competitiveness. And part of the title today is also industrial policy, which is an interesting term because, Senator, traditionally that's kind of been a dirty word in American policy making. It was always associated with picking winners. And yet we hear industrial policy, the term being dusted off a lot more often and spoken of favorably. In your opinion, is it time for the United States to embrace something that looks like industrial policy? And how do we do it right in a way that avoids the waste and the mistakes that it's associated with in the past? And you can perhaps speak to this in your own experience working on the CHIPS Act.
Yeah, great question. And maybe we need to find a different term, but the idea that the United States needs to put some of its money where its mouth is in terms of this contest with China. I come to this issue on China. Hank and I have had this conversation in the past where, 20 years ago, I was very much a believer that the more we did business with China, the more we brought them into international organizations, the more they'd be like us. I think that premise has been just, in my mind, flat wrong. I think, and let me be clear, my beef is not with the Chinese people or Chinese Americans, with the CCP and Xi Jinping's leadership, where China has created kind of almost an Orwellian surveillance state where they take on all dissent, where they take on the Uyghurs, where they take on the people of Hong Kong. And the Chinese model, where they do have ferocious competition initially, particularly in the tech sector, until a Chinese champion emerges. I think about Huawei. I was an old telecom guy, and then that Chinese champion gets virtually unlimited backing from the state. That is a hard, kind of authoritarian capitalism model. That is a hard nut to crack for any American company, European company, Japanese company, because there is no real ability for that Western company ever to become the national leader in China. So I'm very much of a believer that there's going to be a series of areas where we need to compete with China, that we actually ought to be forming an alliance of democracies around technology, because not only what China has done is not only making huge investments in tech areas, but they've actually also got into the field of setting the rules, protocols, standards for new technology, a space that we have kind of owned for the last 50 years. I see it firsthand as a telecom guy in the 5G standards, where China has flooded the zone of the standard setting body. So I think we have to be concerned about that. So the American response, one of the in the Senate this past summer, we passed something called the Endless Frontiers Bill, or the U.S.-China Competition Act. It did a couple of things. One, it made meaningful investment in National Science Foundation, and there was a major debate between NSF and our national labs and where this ought to go. So that debate is still ongoing. Another part where there's not as much debate, and why I'm desperately calling for the House to go ahead and pass this to help President Biden, but also to send a strong signal in light of the Chinese jets flying over Taiwan, is to take the so-called CHIPS component, $52 billion on semiconductors, $2 billion on 5G and open radio access network. That $52 billion on semiconductors, about 40 of it would be used to try to build additional fabrication facilities here in this country, 7 to 10 new fabs. The next 12 would be mostly on R&D. And we need that because not only is China making a much larger investment in semiconductors, but we're also seeing Korea, Taiwan, the Netherlands, Japan make these kind of investments. So if we want to maintain and increase our share of this incredibly important market. I think we have to put capital up. I think we have to find ways to collaborate with other democracies that are in this space to take on the challenges on China. And I believe that this issue around semiconductors and 5G slash ORAN are just the first of a number of areas where I think we're going to have to make these same decisions around artificial intelligence, around quantum computing, around life sciences, where the race is on versus China. And one of the things we also have to acknowledge, even so many years later, the Chinese government gets an enormous advantage because they are voracious in their intellectual property theft. One of the things that the FBI has publicly acknowledged is they open a new counter espionage case against the Chinese government every 10 hours. That's a lot of new cases, literally thousands of per year. And the Chinese have been very effective at kind of keeping the West writ large split apart. And two, it's sometimes a lot easier to steal that IP than create that IP in a host of these fields. So that leads me all the way back around to, yes, I think we are going to need, whether we call it industrial policy or smart investing, and it ought to be less about individual companies and more about sectors where we have to compete. I think we will have to step up and invest. And the good news is, Greg, on this issue, there is broad-based bipartisan support. Virtually every member of the Intelligence Committee, because we've seen this rise, are willing to step up on those policies. And one last thing that we did from the Intelligence Committee standpoint about 3.5 years ago, I organized bipartisan. There'd always be a Republican senator. We bring oftentimes Dan Coates, the director of national intelligence, Chris Krebs, who was the head of CISA, folks from the FBI, others. And we did a series of classified road shows to all segments of kind of American business and academia to kind of give folks a little more insight into some of the operational tools the Chinese were using. We are brushing off those road shows and bringing them back. It's been 3 years since we did the last of them. We did 13 of them a few years back, but we're going to start them again starting in November, because I do think it's important that we continue to make the case to American business and academia. China is an important economy. It is second largest economy, potentially going to soon pass us. And we need our business and academic partners to be at least aware of some of the techniques and tools that the Communist Party of China uses.
I think one of the big questions, Senator, is a lot of people can see the case that you've made for why we need a strong semiconductor industry, but a couple of objections. One might say these are very profitable companies like Intel, companies like Samsung, TSMC, and you're proposing to give them large sums of taxpayer dollars to build plants here, possibly some that might have been built here anyway. How do you justify that? Number two, where do we stop? If it's semiconductors today, why not cars tomorrow, or bicycles, or steel, or something like that? How do we as a market economy draw the line between what is national security or really vital to the national interest and therefore worthy of this sort of industrial policy, and what is not? I guess in some sense I'm saying, how do we prevent rent seeking?
Yes. Both very fair questions. I think when we look at semiconductors, as we're experiencing this worldwide shortage, as we see our inability to even make enough cars right now in America because of shortage of chips, if there's a lead component area to kind of make this investment in, I think semiconductors clearly fits that bill, because there is about a 10 to 20% price differential based upon labor, regulatory, the simply land acquisition in certain cases. These are huge campuses. And I think the general market was saying, if America was not going to invest in some of these incentives, I'm not sure we would be building any more plants in America. These are usually $12 to $15 billion all-in facilities. Yeah, they usually take 4 to 5 years before they hit cash flow positive. And the truth is, simply putting up state benefits was not going to be enough. And we've also seen clearly, when we're looking at a China that is putting, $100 billion into their own domestic chip business, when we also see even countries like South Korea talking about 135 billion, Taiwan, tens of billions, even our European friends. So the market for not just with China, but the market of competitive places where these fabs will be built, if we didn't have skin in the game, we probably wouldn't be maintaining that presence. When you get into some of the traditional old school industries, I agree that these are not areas where we ought to be taking this kind of policy. But I do think when we're talking about major technological innovations, that we ought to be willing to put our money where our mouth is. Years before, we would put a lot more money into basic research. Those dollars, unfortunately, have cut back. But we've gotten huge wins from that. I think about back in 1979, the U.S. government put up what was, I think, about $2 billion at that point. And out of that $2 billion came the whole GPS industry. And God knows that has been a huge benefit, not to a single company, but to a whole wide array of industries that spun out of that. So I do think when we're talking artificial intelligence, when we're talking quantum computing, when potentially even when we're talking some of the life sciences, I think we've thought about in light of COVID, the idea of having at least some domestic PPE capacity and maintaining some of that domestic / Western innovation around pharma. I think these are areas that are worth investing in. But I think, and Greg, I would close simply on this topic of somebody saying, that's why we need a vigorous set of journalists to kind of make sure that we do this right, and don't get into areas where we're picking winners and losers. I mean, let's assume that in the next month, at least a chip component gets done. How the Commerce Department implements that $52 billion will really say a lot about what opportunities we'll have to make future investments. Because if it's not done well, that opportunity goes away. The good news is at this point, at least, it's broadly bipartisan.
Let's turn to another aspect of the bipartisan infrastructure plan, especially the infrastructure part. I mean, there's broad agreement that we need to do more for our roads and bridges, and et cetera. But some of the folks who will be joining us later on the panel have written some penetrating research that, not all infrastructure dollars are spent equally well. And they've said that often we spend too much attention to let's build a big new flashy highway when there are more efficient ways to spread those limited dollars around. So for example, they say we could, rather than build or expand a road, you might be able to repair or utilize existing roads better using things like congestion pricing. Northern Virginia, of course, as you know, has gone heavily into toll lanes and so forth. So my question to you is how have you structured that bill to ensure that the dollars are spent well, that there's cost benefit taken into existence? Because nothing could hurt the cause of infrastructure more than putting a lot of money towards projects that either don't get off the ground because of delays, or when they get off the ground, do not deliver the promised benefits.
Well, we're talking again about roughly a $1.2 trillion over 8-year infrastructure package, the largest in 50 years. And I know some of my Democratic colleagues have said, "Oh, Mark, roads and bridges, that's easy." No, it was easy. We would have done it sometime. We wouldn't have had 4 presidents in a row always talk about infrastructure week, and then nothing happened. And it's, it more than a little bit frustrates me that I got folks in my own party who aren't willing to go ahead and give the president a much needed win on this bill this week. As somebody you opened the program with me talking about trying to help my friend Terry McAuliffe in Virginia. Nothing would help him more than a presidential signing ceremony, bipartisan on infrastructure. On the question of roads and bridges, though, Greg, we are not simply doing this in the old-fashioned way. There's about $110 billion on roads and bridges. There is a lot in there on repairing of bridges, not building new bridges. There's a lot in there on, can you upgrade existing facilities rather than building all new ones? And we've put in there a strong movement towards trying to cut back on the sometimes overly time-consuming regulatory process before you get that shovel in the ground. There was an initiative and I'm forgetting the name of it right now, that started at the very end of the Obama administration, that weirdly the Trump administration never used. It tried to cut back on the permitting process in a very dramatic way. That's built in. But what we've also done in this is not your daddy's infrastructure. It was, I can't read that. Past 41. But this is not your dad's infrastructure bill. There's $47 billion in this bill on resiliency. I've got parts of my state in Hampton Roads that flood on a almost every 2-week basis because of the tides. Resiliency is something we need to invest in. We've made record investments in rail, in transit in this legislation. Part of the ways we get folks off the cars is get them into trains, but you've got to make those investments. $65 billion in this legislation for broadband. Taking that money along with some of the money that came out of the March bill, there will not be a reason why any home, or 98% of all the homes in America, shouldn't have high-speed, affordable broadband. That is an economic necessity post-COVID, and now the dollars will be there to take it place. And I know we started the conversation about carbon pricing and issues in the second bill. I think there is some resentment from some of us who are very involved in this. I was one of the 10 bipartisan senators that put it together. In this infrastructure bill, there's $86 billion in clean energy related items, investments in electric vehicle infrastructure, electric buses. I mean, we're going to buy 25,000 school buses in the next 5 years. Why don't we make them electric and buy them from American manufacturers? There's smart grid improvements, and there's capping of orphan wells. These are things, even on a standalone basis, would be some of the most significant actions on climate that we've ever taken. So, I think this is a good mix of both reform and new initiatives. And boy, oh boy, it is both popular, and we need to get this in place and start at least building out the programs that will implement this bill.
Thanks. Let's now finally turn to research and development. Another big part of the bipartisan infrastructure plan is a significant increase in funding towards R&D, basic research and development. Again, I think that was a priority for you. I want to bring up something that U.S. Trade Ambassador Catherine Tai said in an important speech last week. She said, we've traditionally put a lot of emphasis on research and development and building up our capabilities in this country and so forth, without recognizing the importance of ensuring that the products that result from that R&D and that innovation are made here in the United States. And she went on to say that the process of actually making and assembling things is itself integral to the innovation process, that being able to innovate depends on actually getting your hands dirty with making those products. And that's regrettable that so much of that capability has been offshored in the last 10 or 20 years. My question to you is, do you agree? And how do you ensure that this extraordinary new level of support for R&D in the United States has strong linkages to commercialization and production that redound to the benefit of American workers?
Well, I think the actual dollars in the so-called USICTA bill, there's still some controversy. There's controversy, and that's why I'm saying let's take the chips and 5G pieces out and go ahead and pass those. The normal debate about how this research ought to be done. Should it be done by National Science Foundation? Should it be done by our national labs? We've got a lot of folks who are talking about, number one. But number two, I do think there are areas where if we're making the basic R&D, supplementing that with high-end manufacturing, I think there's a lot of lessons we can learn from the Germans on the tooling and equipment, on particularly around research and development, around technology-based items, where and how they're manufactured. I think there is an ability for the United States to do more in the high-end manufacturing area. But what I don't want to do, as somebody who still remains one of the few remaining folks that believe in global trade nets out to the benefit of most of us, somebody who still thinks TPP should have been sold as a national security legislation, not as a trade bill. I don't think we can move to some kind of Fortress America approach. This is why I very strongly propose, just as there were military alliances after World War II, and we moved to trade alliances, I think in the 21st century, we need technology alliances. And these technology alliances ought to be broader than NATO or broader than Five Eyes. It ought to include countries like Japan and India and Singapore and Taiwan. Obviously, you pick up Australia with the Five Eyes, potentially Israel, other nations, and that area around shared values and shared production across those nations, I think, end of the day, benefits American workers and benefits the overall economy.
Great, thanks very much. I think that you and I have had this conversation before, but and you once told me that like you thought that there was you actually were personally impressed by what China had accomplished with this model. But I think there are those who are wondering, in order to compete with China, are we at risk of becoming like China? Are we? What are your thoughts on how we meet the challenge of competition with China without giving up those elements of the American system, the free markets, the openness and so forth that have served us well in the past? What are your thoughts on that? Just to finish up?
I think I've been very disappointed with not only American business, but a lot of Western business in China, who frankly are willing to turn a blind eye to Chinese policies and tactics that they would never allow or adhere to if it was in America or the UK or in Japan. And I think that kind of too much moral flexibility from some of these companies, with always the excuse being, well, I can't miss the Chinese market, does weaken our hand, number one. Number two, when I talked about our road shows earlier and how we were trying to alert American business to the some of the challenges and a lot of the intellectual property theft, the one group that didn't really ever want to hear our bipartisan presentation was private equity. And part of that was because private equity was making so much money in some of these Chinese tech firms in particular. So I've not been crying bucketfuls of tears as the Chinese regime has really clamped down on these tech leaders. So, I think they are paying the price now of that kind of authoritarian regime. So I think the business community realizes that they don't want to be dependent. I think it's one of the reasons why we've convinced a lot of allies. Do you really want to be dependent on a sole source 5G provider like Huawei that may be taking all your traffic between Paris and Lyon and routing it through Beijing? People are stepping back from that. But I think as we think about this competition, and clearly China's economic advances have been spectacular, but it has come at a real price around freedom. It's come at a real price around respect for rule of law. It's come at a real price around valuing intellectual property and not stealing it. I think there is a window now through these kind of forums that we're doing right now is just kind of say, yes, we got to do business with China, but we should not fall into the idea that that they're playing straight. Their Chinese law says specifically any company has to have its first obligation to the party, not to shareholders. And I think that notion ought to scare any American or Western business who has an appropriate profit margin motivation.
Senator Warner, thanks very much. We're at the 30-minute mark now. You've been very generous with your time and in a very busy schedule. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm sure everybody really appreciated those remarks and insights.
Thank you so much, Greg. Be well.
For the rest of your day. Yeah.
I'm gonna take it from here. My name is Melissa Carney. Thank you so much, Greg and Senator Warner, for that terrific conversation. You hit on a lot of critical topics of timely importance, and we'll continue the conversation now with our panelist discussion. We'll cover a lot of the same topics that Greg and Senator Warner just talked about, related to ways to promote American innovation and competitiveness, specifically with investments in infrastructure, R&D, and thinking about climate, energy, and industrial policy. So I'm delighted to moderate this discussion with 4 nationally recognized economic experts on these topics. I will skip the time it would take to introduce them all and refer you to their extensive bios that are available online and in our AESG products. And instead, I'm going to dive right in to questions with the panelists, if that's okay. I'm going to start with Professor Edward Glaser, who's joining us from Harvard University. Ed, we've just heard a bit from Senator Warner about the political realities of passing a bipartisan infrastructure bill. I want to ask you some questions about the economics of it all. You and Jim Paterba wrote a report for the Aspen Economic Strategy Group that highlighted an economic approach to thinking about how we should invest in infrastructure in this country. And in particular, you emphasize that our nation's approach should be less focused on establishing a top line number, which is what a lot of the political and media focus has been, but instead come from the ground up, looking project by project. Could you elaborate on what you mean and what an approach would look like in contrast to perhaps the approach we generally take in the political process?
Thank you, Melissa. And it's great to be here. The economic approach to infrastructure has two elements to it. First of which is a recognition that there are very few areas in which it is easier to waste billions of dollars really quickly than infrastructure. And so the need to have some form of intellectual discipline that asks, are we actually getting something for our money that covers the cost is really vital. The second thing is an approach that says we want to figure out what's in some sense the national production function of mapping money into output, and that really requires thinking project by project. It's not just a simple black box. We're getting certain things for broadband, we're getting certain benefits for rail, and for every one of them we have to ask ourselves, is this the highest and best use of our money? In some sense, this is a reflection of just Washington realities, right? The essence of Washington in so many areas is to be quite, aggressive in spending, but not very aggressive in controlling. Of course, the poster child of this is Medicare, right? Which is an enormous program, an enormous level of national dedication to providing financial insurance, but very little focus on which interventions would save the most lives or which interventions would do the most to protect us from pandemic. I think in some sense going forward for infrastructure, the hope is that we can bring a little bit more intellectual discipline of the type created by entities like the Congressional Budget Office to this. And that could have happened in one of two ways. During the Obama years, there was a certain amount of enthusiasm for a national infrastructure bank. That would be an approach that would start with an amount of money and would then actually allot that cash to projects that it had chosen that it thought had the highest levels of benefits relative to costs. The second would be some form of national oversight, which would mean that if state agencies which get the cash are using it on a new project, not maintenance, a new project, those new projects would at least have to go through some form of centralized cost benefit analysis and would have to have some kind of internal rate of return threshold. So either of these approaches can bring a little bit of the discipline of asking, are we just building bridges to nowhere? Are we building people mover monorails that glide over empty space? Both of which are things that have come out of our past infrastructure spending. And are we actually making sure that we're delivering the infrastructure that America really needs that will make a difference for our economic future?
Thank you. So you said provocatively that there's no other place where it would be so easy to waste so much money so quickly. So this idea of bridges to nowhere and monorails over empty spaces, I think a lot of people have the sense that, that's a political whim, a political win that might direct money to the wrong places. But there's another issue, which is that infrastructure investment just seems to be really expensive in the United States. Can you explain why that is?
Melissa, I'm not sure I fully can, but I will give it a stab. The numbers are mind-boggling. I mean, we summarize some in our report, which for urban, rail underground infrastructure, it's 3 times as expensive in the U.S. as it is elsewhere in the world to build these projects. And certainly, if you just look at projects like the Second Avenue extension in New York City, they are just mind-bogglingly expensive in terms of the amount of money that's being spent. There are a couple of factors which appear to show up, one of which is in the shape of just our procurement rules, which are clearly not very well targeted to actually reduce costs. Often they are procurement rules that are held over from an era in which we were terrified of any form of public corruption in the procurement process, and that was our largest fear. Those fears are still there, but they're far less important, I think, than the need to figure out how to reduce costs. And typically, we want to have somewhat more flexible procurement rules when we are more focused on cost cutting than when we're focused on just eliminating corruption, in which case you really want to have very, very binding sets of rules. A second factor is we often prioritize other things other than cost cutting. We often prioritize things like Buy American. And of course, I was reminded by this by the senator's comment around electric buses. as the work of Matt Kahn has shown us, Buy American provisions in buses end up being incredibly expensive. And there are very low cost electric bus options from companies like Hyundai. The question is, how much are we willing to sacrifice in terms of cost to get ourselves an American electric bus? And I think that's a real question that we should ask. That's also a question for cost benefit analysis. And maybe there is some Hamiltonian infant industry argument, but you wouldn't have thought that America is coming to the bus production late in the game. You would have thought that we would be fairly mature in producing anything on this. And that in fact, it may well be that competing with South Korean electric bus manufacturers would actually be healthy. A third issue is just the need to hold everyone else free from harm as we undergo these production levels. So the production of the 1950s, epitomized by, say, Robert Moses in New York. Think about Robert Caro's classic, The Power Broker. It was ugly, but it was relatively efficient and relatively fast. And so it ran through existing neighborhoods in a way that I hope that we never will do again in this country. But the reaction to that, and this is traced out in Alan Altshuler and David Lubroff's book, Measure Projects, has been to actually go overboard in the other direction, to make sure that we never just inconvenience anyone. And so when Fred Salvucci came to dig the Big Dig in New York, he was very much motivated by the idea of his grandmother's house being removed by an earlier project. And so nothing was touched. And the project may have cost $18 billion as we bent over backwards on this. The work of Leah Brooks and Zach Liskow has shown us that highway costs between the 50s and the 80s increased dramatically just per square mile, despite the fact that it got cheaper to hire the workers, the materials got cheaper. And one of the things they show is the roads were getting much ziggier, much less straight, and they were much more likely to come with environmental protections, meaning things that stop the sound from going over. Now, those may have been wise decisions, but we certainly made those decisions to protect the local environment without a lot of analysis, without a lot of thinking. We moved from one extreme, which was deeply unfortunate, to another extreme without asking ourselves, have we perhaps gone too far? And so we really do want to think about making decisions that are going to weigh off the advantages of not disturbing the neighborhood with the advantages of creating infrastructure at an acceptable cost.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm going to turn to Professor Ryan Kellogg, who's joining us from the University of Chicago. Ryan, I want to ask you some questions that link this conversation about infrastructure specifically to the climate challenge, and even more specifically to the impending energy crisis. You've written a report for the Aspen Economic Strategy Group with your co-author, Severin Bornstein, and you talk about the many challenges facing the country as we think about transitioning to a low carbon, carbon zero production processes. It will require a lot of efforts to figure out how to maintain stable energy prices in a cleaner way. What are some of those main challenges, and what approaches do you propose or caution against in the way to get there?
Great. Thank you so much, Melissa. And I think the things you highlighted in terms of what we're seeing now in energy markets and in policy debates in DC really get at the core of what I see as the global energy challenge, which is really all about what do we want as a global society from energy? And until the past couple of decades, when environmental concerns have come to the fore, what have we wanted? We've generally really wanted two things. One, we want energy to be cheap so we can all afford it. And then two, we want it to be reliable so that when we turn the lights on, when we flip the switch, the lights actually come on. When we go to the gas station, there's actually gasoline there that I can put in my car. And historically, it turns out fossil fuels, for all their environmental problems, have been really, really good at delivering cheap energy that's reliable. So coal, oil, they're energy dense, they're storable, they're easy to move around. And as a consequence, think about going to a gasoline station to fill up your car with gas. So even at today's elevated oil and gas prices, oil is now as expensive as it's been since 2014. Nonetheless, you can drive to a gas station, spend 50, 60 bucks, depends where you are and how big your tank is, 5 minutes of your time, and you have put enough energy in your car that you can then go drive off for 500 miles. We take it for granted, and to some extent, we're spoiled by the fact that we're able to do that. Then all of this comes from the fact that fossil fuels have enabled us to build a society revolving around energy the way it is. Now, of course, the big downside of all this is all the environmental damage that comes from burning coal, oil, and natural gas, especially climate damages. So we've now come to the point where sort of large scale emissions of CO2, the way we've been doing for the past 50, 100 years, is no longer seen as socially acceptable, and we need to do something about that. And therein lies the challenge, because now we want three things out of energy, not just two. We want it to be cheap, we want it to be reliable, and now we want it to be clean. And it turns out that you can pick two of those three, and you can probably do that kind of easily. Doing all three at the same time is hard, and this is why you need robust policy. So, for instance, the current low-cost technologies for green energy, wind and solar, they're pretty cheap these days, but they're intermittent, which means you can't sort of reliably have an energy supply with those on their own. Green sources that are more dispatchable, so geothermal, battery storage, carbon capture and sequestration, they're reliable, but they're really expensive. So this sort of opens the door to a couple avenues for policy. One is just, how do you help these green technologies compete on the merits? This is a case where broad incentive policies are really important. Senator Warner talked about carbon taxes as one option. Clean electricity or clean energy standards are another possibility. So the Clean Energy Performance Program that's been in the news a lot the past few days sort of billed itself as a clean energy standard. We might talk later about why it kind of was, but not really. Or sort of broad sort of clean energy grant programs sort of fall within the category. One of the things Severin and I sort of try to really emphasize in our paper, though, is that these broad incentive programs, they're really important. They're the linchpin of cleaning up the economy, but they're not enough on their own. So we talk a lot in the report about a bunch of complementary policies that are really important. I'm not going to go through that big long list. Some of that's already sort of included in the bills. So, for example, pathways for building transmission infrastructure is one of those things. The one thing I want to highlight, and this will link up with what some of Ben Jones will talk about later, is research and development policy, particularly with an eye towards remembering, and this is central to climate, is that it's a global problem, it's not a US problem. The US decreasing its emissions on its own won't get us anywhere near where we need to be. The rest of the world needs to do the same in order to solve the problem. What that means is that a big piece of policy needs to be driven at relentlessly decreasing the cost of these dispatchable clean energy technologies. That means sort of big investments in R&D that we can then export to the rest of the world just become hugely important in getting us where we need to go.
Great, thank you. I do want to pick up, you mentioned the Clean Energy Performance Program, and that is such a big news topic these days. And it's the main climate piece of the reconciliation bill. Senator Manchin has openly opposed it. Can I ask you to say briefly your views on that proposal?
Yeah, absolutely. So the ambition and the objective of what the Clean Energy Performance Program tries to do, I think, is in many ways fantastic. So, high level story, and I think Senator Warner mentioned this as well, is that we're trying to give incentives for load serving entities, utilities, retail providers of power, to increase the clean energy in their procurement portfolio by at least 4% per year, by giving them grants if they achieve those targets, and giving them penalties if they don't get there. And one of the things I really like about what the CEPP does is that it thinks about clean energy very broadly. Unlike, say, a lot of state renewable portfolio programs, which really just target wind and solar and leave things like nuclear out in the cold without any funding, or even sort of new technologies like geothermal or anything like that. Clean Energy Performance Program, if you're not emitting carbon, you count. That part's great. What I've been worried about a lot over the past couple of weeks, though, is that even though the Clean Energy Performance Program, CEPP, sort of sells itself as being very almost equivalent to a clean electricity standard, turns out it's not quite the same. So what the CEPP does is it gives you, if you're a utility, really big grants for growing your clean energy share and modest penalties for not doing it. That sort of combination sort of leaves the structure open to strategies that might be just pretty straightforwardly described as gaming. Basically, trades of clean energy and or load with it, sort of customers with it, so that some utilities can really pump up their clean energy in some years and get big grants. and then sort of move that clean energy around so that the government's effectively paying for the same clean energy multiple times instead of creating actual genuine new clean energy. So my big worry this whole time has been that the structure sort of leaves us open to like big government expenditures without a lot of actual real new clean energy. So everything seems up in the air policy-wise at the moment, given the news that came out over the weekend with Senator Manchin. My hope in all this is that this is an opportunity to think broadly about what we want to do and sort of put in place some kind of broad, non-gameable incentive program, that might take the form of a carbon tax, as Senator Warner was talking about, and might take the form of some budget-based, actual real budget-based clean electricity standard. I'm hopeful the answer is not that nothing happens. Sort of having this sort of incentive program in the bill is really, really important.
Great, thanks. So I'm going to ask you one follow-up on that. How do you think about incentive programs like this versus the kind of direct subsidies or taxation of particular industries or particular government bets on certain types of clean investments? I mean, this came up in Senator Warner's comments too. Do you think there's scope for both, or is one sort of always dominant?
I think this is a case where I'm actually bullish on both, though, with limits on how far we go down the road of what you might describe as industrial policy. Again, it's given sort of the need for really driving down costs and doing and investing in research, development, and deployment, they'll add, in early stage technologies. This is a sector where, despite some of the concerns you might have about the usual problems of picking winners with industrial policy, the stakes and the externalities are big enough where I'd sort of this is an area where I'd feel comfortable pushing the boundaries of that more so than, say, investing in buses, the things that Professor Glaser was speaking about. But there are limits to that, right? And there are cautionary tales. Think about sort of all the money that's gone out the door for ethanol over the past 20 years. The big promise of ethanol 15, 20 years ago was that we were going to develop, cellulosic ethanol from switchgrass and all these things that were going to be cheap and not take up a lot of land. None of which has come to pass. The technology has just completely not gone anywhere. Yet we continue to spend lots of money on corn-based ethanol, which has questionable value in terms of greenhouse gases, plus a lot of land use consequences. So, yes, I think, R&D and even sort of, public-private partnerships on new business models for clean energy, those are things in some sense we need to be doing given the global nature of the problem, but there need to be limits and off-ramps so that we don't sort of repeat this path we've gone down with things like corn-based ethanol.
That makes sense, thank you. Okay, Professor Ben Jones with us from Northwestern University. Ben, people have referred to R&D. You wrote a report making the case that R&D would be one of our nation's best uses of money with a high social return. Can you briefly elaborate on why you're so bullish on R&D investment? And then I want to ask, are there certain ways R&D money should be allocated that you think are more likely to yield a high social return? Senator Warner referred to debates about whether R&D money should go to university labs or private companies. What's your view on that?
Well, somewhat different from infrastructure, where I think we might be concerned about the social returns along the lines of Ed Glaser's comments about particular projects. It just starting empirically, when people have looked at various different policy levers in the science and innovation policy space, the R&D space, time and again, we find that the social returns appear extremely large. And sort of an overall number, even conservatively, is that we have this kind of amazing R&D machine that's very effective in the United States. And when we put in $1 of investment, on average, it tends to give us about $5 or more back. So that's a great machine to have. And the sort of number one problem is that we don't seem to put as much money in the machine as we should. And why we don't do that is an interesting question. And of course, the policies we're talking about today, it's exciting to see Congress thinking about putting more money into that machine. But just to be a little bit more articulated, let's take science first, which is typically funded through, grants to universities and national labs. Think of science investments as really, opening doorways, right? And there's just many, many cases you can show quite directly where, scientific investments spark the birth of entire industries, whether it's biotechnology, computing, artificial intelligence, or on and on and on. And if you look more granularly in the data and look at, say, all the inventions in the United States that are patented coming from the private sector, you'll actually see just how regularly they build on new scientific insights. And you'll see that, in fact, the patents that do draw directly on science have more than twice the market value on average than patents that don't draw on science. So there's a real symbiosis there. And then when you turn to more things like industrial subsidies and certainly broad-based subsidies like the research and experimentation tax credit, which we have in the United States and you see in many other countries, studies of that again show, very, very high returns. When you expand a research and development type tax credit, you see the relevant firms, in fact, do more R&D, and they see greater productivity growth in their industry, and it's spilling over to related industries who can benefit from those technological insights. You're seeing more productivity, you're seeing a more productive workforce, a more competitive workforce. And overall in these studies, the social returns again appear to, greatly exceed the cost of investment. So in a sense, policymakers have it much more easy in this sphere, because there seem to be like a lot of levers that when we pull on, even though any individual product or project, it's high risk. You're searching the unknown, you're doing things. These are going to fail all the time. So I don't mean that every R&D project is good. A lot of them are a total waste, but you can't really anticipate that because you don't know exactly what's going to happen when you start a new project. What you see is that kind of these whole categories, whether it's investment at the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, or broad-based subsidies in industry, you're just seeing kind of on average enormous returns. And so, overall, you want to pick across that suite of policies, and they, of course, they work together in some sense. Science is a bit like the left shoe, opening doorways, and commercial R&D is kind of like the right shoe, to kind of go through those doorways and make practical applications of it. When we buy shoes, we don't really just buy the left shoe. We like to buy shoes in pairs. So I think in some sense it's the overall portfolio of investment, and I'm excited to see a lot of the ideas that are in these the Endless Frontiers Act and following on policy debates.
Great. So it seems that there's bipartisan support at this point for more investment in R&D. We heard some of that from Senator Warner, but there's much less support for immigration policies in the US. And yet, whenever I talk to innovation or entrepreneurship scholars like yourself, everyone seems to always point to high-skilled immigration as like a key policy lever that we need to be pulling. How do you think about immigration policy or a human capital agenda more broadly vis-a-vis an R&D policy agenda?
Right. Well, immigration policy, of course, is very complicated, and people come from very different starting points in how they look at immigration policy. But if you come at it from an R&D angle, it looks incredibly beneficial, right? So, what's the key input to innovation, whether it's in science or entrepreneurship or corporate innovation? At the end of the day, it's people, right? It's often STEM workers. And where do those people come from? Well, there's really two basic sources. We can kind of either make them in the United States, by which we would mean kind of the domestic pipeline starting from kindergarten through high school and on, providing the training and exposure to these careers that can cultivate entry into innovative and scientific careers. The other way you do it is you import the talent from abroad. So we mean immigration. And so what do we know about this? Well, one of the reasons, economists and many others, get very focused on high skill immigration is because this is an area, again, where evidence shows, really increasingly definitively that immigrants play extraordinarily central roles in driving scientific and innovative advances in the United States. So just a couple of facts there. A recent study from a group at Stanford shows that, immigrants, looking at all patenting inventors in the United States, immigrants are far more likely to be inventors than people born in the United States, and they produce extremely high value inventions. So that's sort of the inventive landscape. And then secondly, if you look at entrepreneurship, I with colleagues have a recent study that looks at every startup in the United States over a decade. And we find that immigrants are far more likely to start companies than native born Americans. And in fact, they're more likely to start companies of every size. So it could be a very small company all the way to the very big ones. And you don't have to look very far at very famous entrepreneurs like Elon Musk, for example, who is an immigrant. So, an easy and relatively fast way to really accelerate successful R&D in the United States would be to allow more high skill immigration. But of course, the domestic pipeline is very important too, and maybe even more important in the long game. It takes time to build that talent pool domestically. But recent studies as well, using very, very large data sets, including by Raj Chetty and co-authors at Harvard, suggest that we're seeing a lot of talent in STEM, say by third grade math scores. And then you see only a small set of the people with those high math scores actually migrate into STEM careers, usually they're boys, and they come from very high income households. They're usually white, and they're usually in areas where there's already a lot of innovation and they're exposed to these careers. One way to flip that around is to say that we have all this talent among young children in America, but by virtue of where they live, their gender, their race, the household income, they do not end up on these career pathways. And so, not only are we losing out as a society because of what they can do for all of us in terms of propelling standards of living and health, but we're sort of failing at the level of individual opportunity. And I think one feature of the American dream. So that seems to be a great area for bipartisan investment as well.
The missing Einsteins.
The lost Einsteins, right? Is
right, the lost Einsteins,
which I think is very.
Yeah. Thank you. Dean K. Husbands-Feeling from Georgia Institute of Technology. Thank you for being with us. You have a bird's eye view of US technology and R&D policy, sitting at the helm of one of our nation's top technology research institutions, and you serve in many leadership positions in the National Science Foundation. What do you think are the most important steps for the US to take to maintain a leadership role in promoting innovation?
Thank you, Melissa. Good to be here. And I have to say, following on what Ben said, my top priority is clearly talent. And I even say sometimes talent infrastructure, if you will. But let me step back from that because I have a few more for you as well. We're talking about innovation and investment in, to some degree, research and development in the United States. And we're looking at that investment as a primary way for our competitiveness, for improving our health, security, prosperity of the country. It is important for us, if we're going to make any way forward in any of these bills, that we know that we're doing something that the public will get behind. So let me give you a few statistics that I have from a Zogby analytics survey that was done a year ago. Now, more than 3/4 of the respondents said this: they believe America should maintain its global leadership in science, view basic scientific research that advances the frontiers of knowledge as necessary and should be supported by the federal government. More than 3/4 again agree the US is at a critical point for committing to a major new initiative to assure health, security, and prosperity. Also looking at federal government investment and parallel with what incentives could be put in place for private sector investment in science and tech. And again, about 2/3 of those respondents said the Americans say that climate change is impacting their own health. Now, whether or not we can go down the road of who votes for what, but in that 66% of Americans that said that climate change is impacting their health was up 10 percentage points from just about 8 months before. So it's clear. But here's the thing. About 2/3 again expressed concern about the number of children without internet access. So we talked about broadband earlier and how important that is. And about 83% said that they would strongly or somewhat recommend that their child, family member, or other young person enter a STEM field. The reason I mentioned those statistics, and again, it's from a survey, but it's so important for us to understand that the public generally do see, and NSF also has data on this, science is important, and science and technology is important for our leadership and for advancement. How we get there is really important. When we're talking about promoting innovation, though, I fundamentally feel that the talent investment is important, and that talent investment has to be equitable across all N. Usually what I'm looking at in my own research is something which I call the small N problem, or NSF more recently, the missing millions. And that is individuals from rural communities, city neighborhoods, all across the spectrum need to have on-ramps or pathways into these areas that are STEM or STEM adjacent, where we know that there are good jobs and good jobs that would be sustainable into the future. And also for me, I'm looking at these investments in talent, not only in science, technology, engineering, mathematics, but also recognizing that it is so very important to bring alongside with all of this the need for the social sciences and behavioral sciences that are so important to understanding how the take-up of new technology will occur among the individuals that we're trying to serve. I just want to put two more items on the table. So of course, the first one that I mentioned, talent, investment in talent, and broadly so, equitable investment in talent. I would also add to that investment in backbone, internet, broadband, data infrastructure. Those types of infrastructural investments are key to this promoting innovation. And oftentimes we don't necessarily see it. We see a bridge, we see ports. There are many of these infrastructural investments that are very tangible, very noticeable, and very important, obviously. But there's some others that are truly important that would even lift a broad base of society that we need to lean into. And as I mentioned, some of that is on the broadband side, and some of that would be data infrastructure. And I can explain that in a few minutes if I need to. The last point I would make is that it's really important to understand what the users of these innovations will do when they hit the street. We know from our recent example, even of advances in pharmaceuticals or in biotechnologies, that we can make something, but people have to use it to do better. And we need to understand better the behavioral side, the social science side of these investments, so that we truly can see the advancements that we were talking about earlier, that Ed mentioned, that Ryan mentioned, that Ben mentioned.
Thanks. So it's interesting, everything, it's come full circle now. You brought us back to infrastructure, noting that infrastructure investments can also spur productivity and have positive distributional consequences. So I'll ask you a question that relates back to the conversation we had earlier with Ed, which is, what do you think federal and state agencies need to keep in mind when allocating infrastructure and R&D funds to maximize their social value?
And I'm so glad that you have asked a question about state and local, because oftentimes that's where the rubber hits the road, no pun intended, but it's so important to see those investments that are very specific regionally, state by state, and sometimes by localities. There's an example that comes from a paper written by Samuel Jones and Dan Armanios, and it is in the Journal of Construction Engineering Management about a year ago. And it's about bridges and how bridges could actually be built in a way that separates one community from another, could separate a person from taking a bus on a route to get to a job. And think about the way those bridges are constructed. If they're low hanging and buses, you need a bus to get to where you're going. And that's the transportation mode that you can afford, then we need to build infrastructure in a way that facilitates that type of mobility, and literally mobility, but also upward mobility. That's just an example to say that why it's so important for localities, for states, and even sometimes regional decisions to be made about what these policies should be on spending, because it varies by the different populations that exist. A good colleague of mine quoted some statistics recently when she was reporting on and testifying actually on infrastructure. And here is what she said. The average family spends about 17% of the income on transportation, but transportation costs in transportation rich locations is about 9% of that disposable income. But so for households that have low income or extremely low income, transportation costs could be upwards of 40% or more. And so we really do need to think about locations, specific populations, what the needs are there, and actually what are the needs of the local businesses for that talent that they need to have get to their areas for work. Other types of infrastructure that would also matter along those lines would be clean water, which is a huge issue, as you all very well know. And we need to understand better how to serve our communities directly using these expenditures in terms of the infrastructure expenditures that we're talking about. And in my view, those also do lead to increased productivity, as Ben said, and can lead to increases in overall innovation over time.
So I'm going to pick up on your emphasis on local communities. This is something, Ryan, you talked about in your report with Severin too, that we have to think about the equity implications and the effects on local communities when we think about an energy policy as well. Do you want to expand on those observations?
Yeah, and there's a couple of pieces to that when we think about energy infrastructure. I think one is we're talking about part of building a sort of replacing the fossil economy with the green economy is going to require investments in things like new transmission, new generation facilities, and so on and so forth. It is going to be important in order for local communities to accept that, to sort of not repeat some of the mistakes of sort of the early days of the interstate construction program that Glaser referred to in his remarks, where sort of low income and Black communities were effectively sort of actively displaced in a lot of that. Repeating those mistakes is a non-starter. And sort of moreover, as we think about making the transition, it has to be done in a way that's sort of mindful of things like local pollution hotspots, and not just focusing purely on CO2, which is the global pollutant, but also thinking about local emissions as well. And California has sort of recently undertaken some policies that actually empower local communities to participate in these processes. Professor Meredith Fowley at Berkeley has written a nice paper about that, I think with Brookings several years ago. Early returns, it's not clear exactly how well that's going, but it's potentially a model for working forward.
Thanks. So we got a few questions from participants when they registered, all related to the question of how do we make sure that the government spending on these types of projects are more efficient, less wasteful, yield long-term value? That was a common theme we saw in the submitted questions. So I'll first pose that line of questioning to you, Ed. Are there specific things that the government can do to ensure that those types of, that this spending is done in ways that are more efficient and yield better long-term value?
Well, I want to start off with the simplest statement, which I haven't said yet today, and I want to remind everyone of the old joke that 40 years of transportation economics at Harvard could be boiled down to 4 words: bus good, train bad. So that's a starting point. If you wanted to think about a cheap way to provide mobility, buses tend to be great. They tend to be flexible. And if you think about sort of 21st century interurban transit, why does that necessarily involve rail as opposed to an electric bus going autonomously at 150 miles per hour on a dedicated lane? Right. So and the meta point there, of course, is we really do want to let ourselves be more open to new technologies as they come down the front, not just because they're cool and slick and other countries have them, but because they actually can reduce costs. Another thing that we almost assuredly need to do is we need to think more about analysis going in that actually takes seriously the need to cut costs, and where we have cost benefit analysis that's done by entities other than the contracting entity as well, right, itself. So Parsons Brinkerhoff, right, did the cost benefit analysis for high-speed rail in California. You can't have the company that's going to build the high-speed rail do the cost benefit analysis for the high-speed rail. This doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So you really do need to have some form of an independent entity that actually does this. I think going forward, it would make sense to have a significant investment in this, by which I mean a significant investment in executive branch capacity to actually evaluate the cost of local projects and to figure out what we can do to lower these costs. And in some sense, this gets us back to this question about the Medicaid, Medicare kind of thing, that we have this philosophy, which is sort of a combination of we don't want Washington controlling us, but we do want Washington paying for everything. That is a terrible model for almost everything, right? And we really do, if we're going to have Washington spend an extra $1 billion on infrastructure, we really do need to have a little bit more oversight. It's worthwhile spending, millions to save billions of actually having central government capacity to do serious analysis and to also ask what can we do that can lower costs. No private company would undertake a $1 trillion investment program without a lot of thought and a lot of capacity in this area. The federal government needs to do the same thing.
Great, thank you. All right, I have a question for all four of you. Given the ongoing current debates in Washington about the infrastructure bill and the reconciliation bill, from the perspective of the topics we've been talking about, what is your most favorite or least favorite element of, I'll let you pick either one of these bills. And you could even say it would be your favorite if they only tweaked it in such a way. So I'll go in reverse order from my initial questioning. Kate, let's start with you.
Well, of course, I have to say digital equity is key. Everything that we've talked about, if we're willing to invest and invest for the future of all Americans, those investments need to be equitable. Someone needs to define what that means, needs to figure out how to measure it. Ed was talking about benefit cost, and I also would add to that some kind of a way in understanding when we're looking at minimizing costs or at least optimizing the net. What does that mean for certain individuals or certain communities if it's just not cost effective to have the investment there? So the idea that we're looking at, efficient investment, of course, that's important. But I also feel that the equity aspect of that, it's important. And it really does refer to not just infrastructure broadly, but also to energy, equitable energy investments. And so that's important as well. Cuts across everything that we talked about today.
Great. Ben.
So I would point to the science investments in that are on the table, National Science Foundation, Department of Energy, whether universities or national labs, as being my potential favorites. And the reason is, in the 21st century, the United States is in a growth slowdown, right? And public science has also been in a long decline. Federally funded R&D support as a share of GDP is now half its level in the 1980s and nearing its lowest level in the last 70 years. So we are not making those basic science investments. We're not trying to open as many doorways that would allow the rest of us in the marketplace to run through and develop into new and practical applications. And to be clear, it's not like we don't know where to look. It's not like there are not major, even obvious places to invest in science, whether it's in energy production, going to Ryan's comments earlier, or artificial intelligence, or pandemics and infectious disease, of course, on everyone's mind now, or the human genome. Just take it as an example, the human genome we sequenced a while back, much of that genome, nobody does any research on, right? There's a huge part of it that is just a great unknown. We are not scaling up to take advantages of pushing open doorways that we don't know about. And for that reason, we're not going to make as much progress as we might. So that's a place I really hope we don't lose sight of amidst all these other policy proposals.
Ryan.
Yeah. So, the biggest pieces are sort of clean energy incentives. We've already talked a lot about this. I'll highlight something that's sort of a little bit smaller, but a program I'm really, really fond of that's part of the bipartisan bill, which is the orphan wells plugging program. I think it's less than $10 billion. It's a pretty small part of the overall thing. But what I like about it is it's a win in two dimensions. One is that there are hundreds of thousands of oil and gas wells in the US that have been abandoned. The company that used to own them is gone. They've declared bankruptcy. And their environmental hazards spread throughout the United States. At the same time, you have a bunch of displaced oil and gas workers, and increasing displacement of oil and gas workers as sort of the green of the economy goes on, who need things to do. This is a workforce that is uniquely skilled towards the cleanup of this problem. So providing federal funds to clean up these wells, providing opportunities for a workforce that's in many ways highly skilled, but very specifically skilled. So bringing those two together seems like a clear policy win to me. I would like this policy even more if it was attached to another piece that prevented us from having to put federal dollars towards cleaning up these orphan wells in the future. And that would simply be sort of either federal or state level requirements that when somebody puts a big hole in the ground, that they post a bond up front so that they can clean it up so that taxpayers aren't on the hook in the future. We have not historically done that in the past, which is why we need $10 billion to clean wells up now. But given that, sort of, I'm a big fan of that policy that's in the bipartisan bill.
Ed.
I'm gonna return to two themes that I've made before. My least favorite aspect of any of this is Buy American. I want the buses to be cheap. I want them to be electric. I want them to be abundant. And if that means importing them from some other country, I want to do that. So that's certainly my least favorite. I will say that I am not, I've become more open to things like, regional policies that encourage more employment in places like West Virginia. But I don't see how a national Buy American is going to be a very well targeted thing to do that, as opposed to an employment tax credit that targets regions with long-term joblessness problems.
I just want to make sure I'm going to try to restate it. So you don't like the Buy America because it's not an efficient way to help our workers. It costs us a lot of money.
That's right. It's not an efficient way to help our workers, and it seriously detracts from our ability to green our infrastructure, to green our transport system quickly and efficiently.
Right. So I'm always partial to the Arthur Oaken approach to thinking about public finance, which is, how do we think about equity versus efficiency trade-offs? And it sounds like with all the topics we've been talking about, there are ways that we could advance both efficiency and equity, and they're not necessarily at odds when it comes to investing in infrastructure innovation. So maybe that's an optimistic place to wrap this panel. So does anyone have any final remark they want to make or something they want to respond to? Great. Well, then in that case, I thank you all for joining us today. I want to thank Ryan, Ed, and Ben for the reports they wrote for the Aspen Economic Strategy Group. Those are available on our website, economicstrategygroup.org. They will be released as part of our group's annual policy volume that will come out in mid-November. There will be a set of other memos accompanying these memos on infrastructure and innovation that have to do with other facets of building a post-pandemic economy, focusing on inequities, longstanding inequities in K through 12 education, the work from home revolution, ways to support businesses and workers through the recovery and beyond, and international trade cooperation. So I hope everyone will keep an eye out for the release of that book in mid-November. And in the meantime, go ahead and visit our website and download the reports we've been talking about. Thanks everyone for being with us today.